Hello and welcome to another episode of the Gooners Podcast. Today I've been deserted by Owen and Andy, my two partners in crimes, those punks. One of them apparently thinks his baby daughter is more important than doing this podcast. And he'll come around and learn about that. The other, Andy, is his birthday today and he's off skiing at Vail Resort, which means he will more than likely need the services of today's guests very, very soon. So by way of introduction, first of all, welcome to the pod, Colin. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
And, if you've been following and watching our pod for a while, you know how we do things. If you've recently discovered us, we're glad that you're here. There's a lot of Arsenal podcasts out there with a lot more qualified, knowledgeable, tactically sound individuals than us. But what we try to do to separate ourselves out is into different categories, kind of let more interesting people than ourselves join us and talk about their time at Arsenal, their history, their relationship with the club, and we want to bring them to you. So in our ever ongoing quest to do that, we're happy to welcome today someone who, if you've been following the club over the last 25 years, you surely know who he is. Along with his cousin Gary, he's one of the best known physiotherapists, I'd say, in England. A consistent presence with the Arsenal from 1995 to 2018, including the last 10 of those years as head of medical. Perhaps as Gooners, some might think we saw him on and around the pitch a little bit. Gooners podcast, Colin Lewin. Thanks for joining.
How you doing? Yeah, no, thanks for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure. So, Colin, these days you and Gary are working together again. It's an amazing coincidence that the job that you got, was at a place called the Lewin Clinic. I mean, what are the chances of that? No, but seriously,
it took us ages to think of that name. It took us ages.
I mean, having moved from working for a club like Arsenal, and Gary also with the English team setup, I mean, it would seem like a seamless move to creating your own private practice in East London. And it seems like many of the footballers that you've tended to on the pitch and in training have followed you there, either as friends or clients. Was the transition seamless, or were there challenges or difficulties in getting the practice up and running?
Yeah, it was tricky. Probably took longer than we thought, actually. I left Arsenal May 2018. A few weeks later, Gary left West Ham, where he'd been there for a year. So we had a chat and we said, now what? And we thought, if something doesn't come up that's of any interest to us in the football or sporting world, we should think about setting something up. And we sat down eventually in about October to start working on this. And I'd had a chat previous to that with the investors. We'll talk about them in a minute. And it took us almost a year from the idea to actually opening the place, which was way longer than we thought it was going to be. But it took us that amount of time. But in that time, we secured 3 investors who you probably know are Aaron Ramsey, Petr Cech, and Mesut Ozil. And we had help from a load of people, including Arsene Wenger, David Dean. Dick Claw is our unofficial business advisor, and God knows we need advice, believe me, on the business side. And here we are. It's been nearly 18 months.
You're doing the right way. You're rushing into something can be worse than waiting and taking your time. And I think you guys have been properly advised and appropriately patient. So, and like you said, you've had a lot of support from footballers, both in the design of the clinic, the memorabilia, which gives it a distinctively football kind of taste. And you've mentioned the 3 investors. It sounds like, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like the type of place you'd love going to work to every day. And, I'm pleased that it's been such a quality venture for you guys. And, you're just getting started from what I can tell.
Well, yeah, it's ours. So we designed it how we wanted it. We've got a 1,000 square foot gym because that was really important to us that we had a rehab gym with the equipment that was necessary. But yeah, to come in and see the shirts on the wall and that sort of stuff, and 4 or 5 of the shirts can go on rotation on silly mannequins. It's a silly thing, but people like it, and we've got a lot of shirts to rotate up there. And they're not just Arsenal ones. We've got a few shirts over the years, so we put some interesting ones up. And
I just think I was telling you before the podcast about my trip to London before the lockdown and how I ended up rushing home, because I do kind of wish that instead of coming home, I had just gone to East London and kind of just burrowed myself into the clinic, because I could be like an Adonis right now. I mean, you guys, what you could have done with this over the course of 12 months, I'm sure. No specific injuries, just an entire body injury that I have for 47 years.
12 months, yeah.
Yeah, 12. I mean, my wife and family would gladly give me up for 12 months if they knew that I'd return, as a footballer. So anyway, you and I are the same age, despite, I mean, I couldn't, until Friday, at least when I jump ahead of you, but while you look younger and you've got decades more than me left on this planet, when you just, when I look at how long you've been involved with the club and when you got involved with the club, it's just, it actually surprised me to find how young you are. And so we roll the clock back to 1995. At not quite 22 years of age, you begin a career that would end up spanning more than half of your life eventually. It's 95. It's an off period at Arsenal, but you come out of the University of Brighton and immediately start working for the Arsenal. I mean, did you know somebody there that might have?
You know what? It was never the plan. It was never the plan. I was going to go and work in the London hospitals, and had a chat with Gary in about that April, May of that year. And the fella who was his assistant at the time was leaving. And so, yeah, he said, do you want to come in? And the original plan was to go for a year or so, just to work with there was no academy system then, but to work with the youth team, work with the reserves, get a good year of experience in the sporting world, with someone I knew, trusted, and, was related to. So in shocking nepotism, I get the job for what was going to be a year or so. And yeah, ended up being 23. So yeah, 3 years of working with those youth teams, with Pat Rice as the manager, don't forget, he was in charge of that. And Arsene came in 18 months later. We'll go into that in a bit. But yeah, to be around that environment so young, so early in my career, it was a great place to learn.
What's amazing to me, I mean, I think about when I was 22, 23, I was also just out of university, and you have medical training and you're obviously, skilled at what you do, but by the same token, you're 22, 23, 24 years of age, and all of a sudden you're surrounded by Seaman, Wrighty, Dixon, Adams, Dennis Bergkamp, for God's sake.
Yeah, we joined the same day. Me and Dennis. Yeah.
I mean, and then those are all guys that are football idols who are a handful of years older than you. Then you've got young players like Vieira and Nelka who are also in your care. And I mean, I'd expect the professionality to come out, but is your head spinning, or at the time like these are among the first people who having graduated university with these skills and this training that I'm actually working on? I mean, was that bizarre?
A little bit. I've been around it for a while, in that I'd obviously known Gary for years, we're cousins. And so I'd been to the training ground a fair few times, been to a good few games, and I met these fellas after the games. So it wasn't a complete, who are you, on day one. So I knew them to a level. Bruce Riot was in charge. And so, yeah, it was a little bit odd to have that level of football around us, I remember going to the Everton away game that season because Gary wanted some help at the game. And, you're coming back on the bus after the game. You don't care it's midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning. You're on a bus on the way back from Everton, having beaten them, by the way. And it was just a great environment to be in. Yeah, it was good. And then, I stayed in a hotel that night near the training grounds because it wasn't worth going home. We were in a few hours later. And I remember having a bowl of chips with Martin Keown in the bar because he was staying there as well. So we would get back to this hotel at 3 a.m. and order a bowl of chips.
Is that all you ordered?
That's all we ordered, yeah. We were just sat at the bar. We had to get up in 3 hours, 4 hours. Training was, we were in the next day for recovery day. And it was just really odd to be sat at the bar with Martin Keown having a few chips and chatting about the game that, we'd won the game. So, yeah, that part of it was really nice in the early years to be going to the games as well occasionally. obviously that got more and more when it got to about 98. But those first 3 years, I would go into a few games, and I enjoyed it. It was a very enjoyable place to work, as you can imagine.
Well, that's I can't imagine. Well, I can't imagine, but in any case, we're going to kind of flip around in timing a little bit. In 2008, Gary leaves to work for the England national team setup, and that is presumably what triggered your ascension into the role of head of medical.
Yeah.
At the tender age of 35, we have a question from Grant Sales on Twitter from Chertsey, which I think is not far from Heathrow Airport. How much of a change was it to become head physio? I mean, what was it purely kind of managerial to where now you're in charge of a team rather than being part of the team, or more responsibilities? What was the transition in 2008?
It was a very similar role, obviously, because I'm working with the same people. So in many ways, other clubs and physios at other clubs are changing their manager every few years, and have got to get used to their way of working and form new relationships. It's tough, and I wouldn't want that to happen to me too many times. But Gary moving on to go to England, which was great. There was no sackings there. He was moving on to go to work with England, to work with those coaches who I'd worked with for so many years, to answer to Arsene Wenger, who I'd worked with for a good few years, over 10 years. It wasn't that difficult. I suppose the buck then did stop with me. My decisions became a bit more important, along with the doctor. You have these decisions around players returning to play and training. But I did have to select my team a little bit. But, I'd had a good grounding in the place. I knew everyone there really well. I'd worked with them for years. I knew the daily routine. Gary had given me a hell of a grounding in managing difficult issues. It's not just physiotherapy. There's all sorts of political stuff, managerial stuff, you can imagine.
Yeah.
So no, the difference was the buck did stop with me, but I had a great doctor working with me, and I could make my own team in the background. So I brought some physios in who I interviewed, chose, worked with. So it was quite nice to have my team and not do it my way, because not a lot changed, but the buck did stop with me.
Yeah, well, you were certainly well prepared for it over the 13 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the political managerial elements of it, since you've given me such a good segue here. Arsene Wenger, your career at Arsenal almost exactly, with about maybe 1 year of difference, overlaps with his. And over those 23 years, we can point to a lot of injuries in sports. We all know the names. We'll discuss some of them in a bit. But obviously there's people may or may not realize how much of a connection there is between the medical department and the coaching and the management and the player recruitment and day to day, even the contract extensions. When you mentioned Dick Law earlier, I'm sure that wasn't just a passing relationship. It was very important for him to know your thoughts on players. But as far as Arsene is concerned, he came into the club with his own kind of approaches to things like fitness and diet and training. And if you would just kind of share your experiences and feelings about Arsene, what it was like to work with him, whether your kind of philosophies in his meshed or evolved or clashed, we'll talk about kind of both of your departures a little bit later on, but just your relationship with Arsene over time. Was it complicated? Was it great?
No, it was good. It was really good. He's a very fair man. Very fair, very calm man, which was always helpful when things weren't always calm. To actually have someone like that in charge of the place was good. He set great standards around work ethic. Over all of that, I think the biggest thing was that he trusted us. And I can only think of one or two occasions where he didn't go with our recommendation. And even then we discussed it and it wasn't clear cut. And, so if we wanted players out of training, or players to be in training, or players to miss games for whatever reason, there was never this big argument, never this big clash. It was trusted, which was helpful. You didn't go into the office nervous every morning expecting an argument in the manager's meeting. So
is that just through osmosis or anecdotal evidence? I take it that's not always the case at other clubs. Or
no, of course not. Of course not.
Relationships.
Of course not. I think I think we were lucky we had that stability for so long. So by the time I'd taken over in 2008 from Gary, I'd known Arsene for a long time, over 10 years, and probably got things wrong, got things right. He'd made mistakes, I'd made mistakes. We'd been through an awful lot. We'd won an awful lot in that time, which helps build relationships, don't forget. And yeah, we just had a fairly good relationship. I think the coaches around him were good with us and trusted us. And, I was always pleased with that relationship. There were never any huge fallings out between coaches and medical team, which you're right, it does go on elsewhere. And there's only one winner most of the time.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we've seen it at Chelsea. We've seen it pretty much anywhere Jose Mourinho's gone. but that's my opinion, not yours. Quick shout out to the chat. Good to see so many people and friendly faces in here. Bulgarian Gooner, Justin Benny, Yo-Yo, Daniel Robert, Out and Out Gunners podcast. Mike Kurz is in the house. Hoakland 13, Joshua Stark, who says Anthony Stark says hi. I don't know if that's someone that you know, but if it's not,
sure.
he just
Maybe.
wants to know how you are. Sam and a lot of these questions that you guys are asking, we're going to be getting to, and don't hesitate to repost them. We'll try to get to as much as we can. So first, I want to point out something so that you don't have to, and this is something I read in one of the pieces that were done on yourself and Gary over the years. The medical team help injured players regain fitness. They do not cause the injuries in the first place. There's this kind of myth of, Arsenal have a lot of injuries. The physios and the medical team must not know what they're doing. And that just couldn't be further from the truth. The medical team doesn't go out and slide tackle people and kick them in the legs and make them run too hard and that sort of thing. So, but with that said, I trust I'm not, out of line in asking you this, but you've expressed a philosophy on Arsenal's quote unquote reputation of having, more than our fair share of injuries. Something that is by no means limited to the Wenger years. It's certainly continued after that. And maybe it's unconscious bias on the part of fans like myself, but you don't actually blame bad luck for injuries. You don't portray it as being a random, unfortunate event.
No.
Sam in the chat's asking, do players get injured more at Arsenal than their previous teams? It certainly seems to be the case. Partey is one example of that. People rumor Colney's training gown is really hard, and that's something that a number of people, Tom Canton, Rob Ford, Owen, myself, all kind of ask the same question. I mean, what do you kind of see as being the culprit or culprits of the injury bug that seems to hit Arsenal so much harder than other teams?
Well, the important word there is seems to hit Arsenal so much harder than it wasn't the case. Of course, we had some terrible years when it actually really was the case. I can think of 2 or 3 years where the numbers were very high, especially when they're high-profile players. First of all, it's not the pitches. The training ground is an unbelievable facility, and the pitches are second to none. It's an unbelievable place to train, and all players comment on that when they come from other clubs or when they go on loan to other clubs from Arsenal. It's just the best you're going to get. They're just excellent, and that's not me being defensive at all. It's just a very,
you didn't build the pitch at Colney, but I mean, like the rumors are that it's harder. I mean, it's not quite 3G like they play, in some of the.
It's just it's unbelievable. It's just so good. You couldn't talk enough about it as being an excellent training ground with a great surface on every pitch. It seems to be. So going back to the injuries, the Premier League, which is completely bizarre, has never had an injury audit, an official injury audit. God knows why. It'll come very soon, I'm sure. So what's left then is for websites to go through reports in newspapers to create league tables around reported injuries. Now, for the statisticians out there, that's not a good thing to do because you're analysing squads of 20 versus another squad of 30. Perhaps Arsenal had a squad of 30. You've got Arsenal playing 60 games a year, West Brom playing 40, and suddenly, Arsenal got 1.5 times injuries that West Brom have got. Of course, they're playing 1.5 times the games. The squad, you're analysing 30 players versus 20 players. So those league tables perpetuated into this idea that Arsenal and Man United at the time had this horrible injury record. And it just statistically was awful because we knew the truth, we were in it. And we helped UEFA with audits over the years. So we knew where our numbers were compared to the Champions League teams. So injury prevention for me and for everyone in the medical world is, first of all, recruitment. If you're bringing in fit, young, strong players without an injury history, the chances are, there's always exceptions, but the chances are they're going to carry on that way. Unless your training is awful, which Arsenal's wasn't, then it's going to carry on that way. So recruitment is number one. If you're bringing in a squad of robust players, they're going to be robust. If you're taking chances on other players that aren't quite robust, which some clubs have done, which Arsenal have done over the years with a few players, the injuries are going to go up. We know that. Age is a big thing as well. But I think we have to accept that where there were 2 or 3 years around 2010, 11, 12, where we had an awful track record. Our injuries were not good in those years. We had too many, and they cost us points, I'm sure. But you're going to have bad years, you're going to have good years. It also got completely exacerbated by the fact we weren't winning anything in that time. We weren't winning games, we weren't winning cups, we weren't winning leagues.
People were looking for a reason, and the reason is games lost from top players.
Maybe,
it's a cycle.
What was our injury record in 2002 and won the double? No one's got a clue. We won the league, who cares? But when you're not winning competitions, I think you start to look for things like that. And, 2002 actually wasn't a great year for injuries. The Invincible year actually was excellent, which is coincidental and also a great help. But there's years Arsenal have won cups and won leagues where the injury record was awful. But who cares?
Yeah, so you don't look back on those. That's a good point.
I think the problem you have nowadays, sorry to go on about it, but I think the problem you have nowadays as well is that some teams, certainly not Arsenal, but some teams, you get the medical teams working for the idea that it's important we keep our injury numbers down. We're forgetting the whole idea of football. The win metric should trump everything else. Win games. If you have a couple of injuries and you win 1-0, you've got the 3 points. Great stuff. Would you rather draw 0-0 and have no injuries? Of course not. So I think that has to be remembered as well, that, we have to win games. And if that means putting a couple of players at risk occasionally on a risk analysis, which is balanced in agreement with player, manager, medical team, that has to happen occasionally.
Yeah, I mean, I look at, and I was going to mention this a little later in the pod, but it's more organic right now. I mean, you see some situations with teams like this, and I'll admit, I'm just going off of feel. I'm not looking at injury records. I could be completely off base on this, but you see Leicester City the year they won the Premier League. I don't remember ever seeing a starting 11 that wasn't the same from week to week. I mean, or nearly the same from week to week.
One game a week, don't forget.
Understood. Yeah. And the same thing, same dynamic, same reason. I kind of feel this year with West Ham and to a certain extent Aston Villa. Leicester City's got the injury bug a little bit more than normal this year, but you see these wonder seasons from teams. Sheffield United last season that are maybe unsustainable. They're just the confluence of players who are playing above their station, who all have significant belief in the goal together, and incredibly good fortune with injuries. Or maybe it's not just good fortune; it's what you were just talking about with, sacrificing long term for the short term, which this is a sport. It just seems like the lack of injuries in those is almost always the subtext to how they're able to excel well beyond the expected value of their squad.
I think a robust squad being trained well, playing one game a week, won't have many injuries. Doesn't get simpler.
And that's interesting. And I guess one reason why Manchester City seems to be immune to the injury problem is because their second team could be probably competitively top 4 along with their first team most years.
And they can buy finished products as well. They can buy robust players.
Yeah, so someone gets hurt in December, they buy a world-class player to replace them in January. I mean, it's and there's not many clubs around the world that can say that. So Justin asked, does mind over body mindset really work? Fans of people say, and I'm reading this because some people will just be listening, not watching. You hear fans and people say, "Oh, he's always injured. It's in his head." I can't believe this is the case. Thank you, of course, for your service to our club. Does the injury-prone label get into the head of footballers? It doesn't matter.
I don't know is the answer, but I think mentality plays a part for sure. You do have some players that will play through certain pain, play through certain injuries, and get away with it, versus players who need to be 100% to step onto the grass. So, yeah, you're always going to have players that you would consider hard, robust, strong-minded, and you're going to, at the other end of the scale, you're going to have players who have got to be pain-free to get out onto the pitch. Don't make me name names, Mike, but every club's got them. So
I'll do a post-pod show where I just name all the names.
Yeah. But is it mind over matter, mind over body? No, but psychology is an important part in injury recovery as well as everything else.
I can't imagine how underestimated psychology actually is in that. I mean, I think there's a saying about, or just a kind of a thought process that playing not to get hurt can put you at more exposure of getting hurt. If you pull out of certain challenges, if you, just having the mindset of, oh, I don't want to get injured in this collision or this, it'll certainly impact your performance, but can it also make you more liable to sustain a soft tissue injury or that
goes into training as well, Mike. I think, clubs are realizing now, that Arsenal have for years as well, that you have to train as you play. If you don't sprint all week in training, the first time you sprint in a match, the first time a week, not exactly, but you're at more risk. And so the analysis that goes into training now to ensure players are exposing themselves on the right day to certain things, I think is enormous and really important. But, S&C coaches work with clubs and they know that.
No, that's fascinating. I've always been, I tend to focus more on the mentality and the psychology and the groupthink of a football club than tactics. It's a defense mechanism because I'm shit when it comes to understanding football tactics. But it's fascinating to me. We're starting to get some good questions in the chat that are exactly where we were headed in the podcast. So Drago, my question was going to be, we've seen some injuries in our time at Arsenal that were just horror situations that could have happened anywhere to anyone, regardless of training and that sort of thing. So, February 23rd, 2008 and February 27th, 2010, 2 days that will live in infamy for Arsenal. I think we should just cancel football the final week of February this year and we'll be fine. But the first one, of course, is Eduardo at Birmingham. The second one is Aaron Ramsey at Stoke. The Eduardo injury, Gary was treating Eduardo out on the pitch, and you went to hospital with him that day. And that's been described as being just the horror of horror injuries. So, and with Ramsey, you had ascended then to becoming the head physio by that point. And I would assume that you were the first, if not the first, to reach him out on the pitch when
I was.
Players were waiting. I mean, have you ever run as fast as you run in those situations? I mean, do you train?
No.
This was actually a joke, but it's not a bad question. Do you train so that you can get out there quicker in this?
No.
Okay. That would be awful if you like pulled a hamstring or something. I mean, did I hear that Gary got hurt?
It's happened.
Gary got hurt with England one time. Was it running out on the pitch?
No, Gary broke his ankle in Brazil in the World Cup. For fracture dislocation of his ankle, his foot got stuck in a gutter by the bench. Long story short, he was stretchered off, which is ridiculous, isn't it? But funny enough, that day I was at Aaron Ramsey's wedding, watching that on a big screen, which is a mad aside. No, you don't train to run on a pitch for 50 yards, no. But I do know physios that have pulled their hamstrings going on the pitch.
Yeah, I mean, I would be like lying there on the touchline, like, go on without me.
I've seen that before. I've seen a physio by the side of the pitch tell a player to get up because he didn't want to run on. But,
so without breaking medical confidentiality laws, I mean, tell us about these injuries, how bad they were. And, you know, again, as I'm accustomed to focusing on, what was the emotional state of the players, both, you know, in the wake of the injuries and in their comeback trails?
The Eduardo one was horrible. And, you know, everything's in the public domain. I'm not telling you anything new here. But the ankle had been pretty much ripped off. It wasn't really dislocation. It was just a horrible wound. And the ankle had been torn away from the leg pretty much. The foot had been torn away from the leg. So it was at a nasty angle by the time it even got to us in the ambulance. And we were very lucky that day. The game was in Birmingham. And the local hospital for that game, which we all know before the game, there's meetings before the game. We know where everyone's going if something nasty happens. There's emergency action plans in place. So we knew we were going to a hospital called Selly Oak, which happens to be the hospital where soldiers are taken who come back from active duty. So when we got there, we were waiting for a surgeon to come in. And the surgeon came in as blasé as you like, saw the ankle and thought, well, that's not much. I've seen worse than that, and really reassured Eduardo around. Yeah, we'll get you in tonight. We'll get that fixed up. Don't you worry about that. And
he's comparing this to landmines and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, a little bit. So that was just a twist of fate that we ended up in Selly Oak in Birmingham, and, you know, forever grateful to the people there who were brilliant with him. But yeah, all he could think about in that few hours where he was struggling was there was a Euros that summer. Have I got that right? Or a World Cup?
It was February of 2008, so there would have been a Euro, yeah.
Yeah, you're right, Euros. And so, yeah, all he could think about was that he was going to miss the Euros, and that's all he kept saying. I'll make the Euros? No, probably not, but let's not discuss that now.
Yeah.
So that was tough for Eduardo. And obviously we drew that game 2-2, and all the fallout around that match, if you remember it. That
was the Gallus sitting down and crying on the pitch.
Yeah, well, it wasn't a good day around.
I've heard it described as a sliding doors moment for Arsenal because that was like
I got back to the stadium, you know, well after the match. The bus had gone. I walked into the stadium just to work out how I was going to get home, and I think they'd organised a car for me. And I walked into the stadium, and Philip Senderos was there. He'd been drugs tested and couldn't pee. So the bus had left him behind and said, well, we'll organise you to get home as well. And we both had a car. So a very quiet drive back from Birmingham with me and Philip in the back of a car. But yeah, you're right. But when you say those dates, it's amazing how you know them straight away. You don't forget those dates when horrible things like that happened. I knew it was February 23rd, 2008. It's awful. Aaron's was a lot less horrific. You know, it was at Stoke. It was a closed fracture. Yes, it was at 90 degrees and looked awful, but it was a closed fracture. Gary O'Driscoll, the doctor, who's a really close colleague, great at his job. He
currently had a medical with Arsenal, right?
Say again.
Gary O'Driscoll, current. Right.
Yeah, he's still there. Great fella. And he was just behind me onto the pitch. And the Stoke players were also very good that day. The majority of them calming him down. And yeah, he got the Entonox gas into him straight away, which is a painkiller gas. And Gary reduced the leg. You get one attempt at straightening it, really, and various neuromuscular assessments that go on around our training. And yeah, we got him off the pitch, and he came back to London that night and had surgery. Yeah, again, came back, made it back well.
His mentality, I mean, I don't remember. I don't think Wales qualified for the 2010 World Cup in Brazil, but
he was okay. He was okay. Obviously, you speak to the family, you speak to the agent, you calm people down and give them as much information as you can, and then get people around him. And yeah, he had surgery and was back up and walking really quickly, because with that particular surgery, you get walking on it quite quickly. And yeah, he was back in 6-7 months, if I remember rightly, and went on loan to Nottingham Forest briefly just to get some games.
Yeah,
but yeah, things like that, you stay very close to the players after things like that, and yeah, we still talk a fair bit now.
Well, I'm sure that is no small part as to why your current business relationship and the friendship is still there. the incredible thing talking about those two injuries, as Yo-Yo says in the chat, Eduardo made the Brazil World Cup. So from February 2008 to summer 2010, I mean, that's a good long time, but, making the World Cup roster and just being fit by the time 2 years later it rolls around are two different things. And it was great.
He played. Go on.
I was going to say, has a returning player to the Emirates from another team ever been cheered for scoring against us before the way that he was? I mean, just such a great story that he was able to come back, and you wish he could have done so for us. But
yeah, I mean, did he ever get back to where he was? That's very subjective, isn't it? But everyone was so behind him. He's such a great mentality, and he was back in about 8 months. And then he went.
And you can say Rambo definitely got back to where he was beforehand. In fact, probably better. Yeah. And we all know what he did for Wales in the Euros. I mean, that might have been quite a few years later, but that was great. Hello to Naeem from Pakistan. Always love to find out where people are from. So if you want to drop your location into the chat, even if you know that I know where you're from, we'll let Colin know where he's being reaching out to. Thanks for watching us. The Highbury Squad, the Ballond podcast winner, Sophie. Appreciate you tuning in. So the other, I mean, I would get absolutely ransacked if I didn't bring this person up in the podcast. Abu Diaby, was the May 2006 Sunderland injury. I mean, that's a hard challenge. I mean, do you see that as the precursor to everything else that went wrong, or are these unrelated? I mean, how do you? He's kind of the definition of what people think, unfortunately, when they use the word injury prone. Just a cursed situation as such a talented footballer. Does it start with something like Sunderland, or was it always just going to be that way, even if he hadn't had that challenge?
Well, we'll never know, will we? But I think that Sunderland challenge was a fracture dislocation of his ankle, which was repaired, fixed, and in the months afterwards, we couldn't quite get the range of movement back in that ankle. It's called dorsiflexion, where your ankle, comes up to there. We had trouble getting full dorsiflexion back, which can happen sometimes after surgery because there's a fair bit of metal work going on and things are tightened up and repaired. And we just had trouble getting that back, and that causes problems up the chain. The biomechanics being as they are, it does cause problems up the chain. He had second surgery on the ankle to try and improve that dorsiflexion. It improved it a bit. But no, we never got it back. Now we got him back. He was feeling good. He was pain-free. He was able to twist, turn, run, jump, use a ball. He was doing everything. But we all knew his mechanics had changed because of that lack of range of movement in the ankle. And it ultimately probably played a big part in all the other problems that he had consequently. Yeah,
if you're running in an unnatural way, you're going to put too much pressure on certain areas of the body, and
probably. Now, we all look back with great regret about not being able to get that dorsiflexion. It wasn't just one person working on it, don't forget. There were osteopaths involved. There were numerous physios, doctors, surgeons giving opinions. We just couldn't get it back, and it was just a consequence of the surgery. It fixed him, it repaired him, but that range never quite got back. It's not as simple as that, of course not. But it's something we look back on and think biomechanically it changed him. Probably had an effect on him later in his career.
Yeah, well, that's unfortunate. I mean, I just wish we could have seen what he would have had to
I agree.
To show. So, the craziness though is how you get these players back. I mean, I grew up. I'm going to use an American reference here for an injury, but I grew up, watching American football. I'm from the Washington D.C. area, and most Americans who are old enough and supporters of American football will know where they are, and will also remember the date when Joe Theismann broke his leg. Joe Theismann was a Hall of Fame quarterback for the Washington football team, as we're now called, and they were playing on Monday Night Football, nationally televised game against the Giants, the New York Giants, and his leg snapped in half, and it was widely visible, much more so than the Ramsey, or those things happen in collisions. This was basically camera right on his leg as it snapped in two. And those injuries have happened before and since, but the moment that happened and he was carted off the field, you knew that was the end of his career. That doesn't happen anymore. I mean, career-ending injuries for someone who otherwise isn't close to retirement anyway are almost just, they don't happen anymore unless they're, organ related as opposed to bone or musculature and stuff. And it's just, I mean, it's rather incredible. Is that due to surgical advantages, or surgical advances in physiotherapy and rehab, the amount of money that's really waiting for you to get back on the pitch, or combination of all those things? Because now it's almost, I mean, for something to keep you out more than 1 year is almost unheard of, even in the case of ACLs and leg breaks.
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I think everyone's learning every year, aren't they? I think surgical procedures are getting better. The access to the best people with regards to the surgery, I think, everything's improving. Physiotherapists, techniques, the individuals involved in it. It's a team game now. You rewind 30 years, it might be one physio at a club looking after 28 players. Now, the clubs have got 4 and 5 physios. So I think you've got more people there. The quality of care has to improve. That's before you even talk about the facilities and everything else. And the other facets of medical team, doctors, nutritionists, psychologists, massage therapists, S&C coaches now. I think, the team behind the team has improved from where it was, for sure.
Yeah, and you've mentioned the kind of the 2 games a week versus 1 game a week thing. I just want to bring something to your attention that I've noticed, and I want to know what the differences are, because there are some players. We've talked about how teams have really good luck with injuries. There are some players who just seem superhuman, and then none of them appear, other than maybe Granit Xhaka, to play for Arsenal. But this season there's been a lot of discussion about, for instance, we've got 3 massive games in 8 days coming up: Olympiacos, North London Derby, Olympiacos again. None of those 3 games can we afford. I mean, I suppose unless we run out to a huge lead in the first leg and can cruise to a draw or something in the second game. But none of those 3 games can be taken lightly. We're going to have to put our best team forward in those 3 games. But by the same token, we all know that with our 11, you're not going to see the same 11 out there for all 3 games, even if injuries are avoided. There's going to be rotation, and rarely do we see many of the field players play full 90 minutes in both games. I've separately from that, I've kind of become a fan of non-league football. I kind of had an affinity for Sutton United after we played them in the FA Cup a few years ago, to where I've actually visited Gander Green Lane. I've become friends with a lot of the supporters down there, and they've got a bloke down there who I'm sure Craig Eastman.
Yep.
And he's 30 now. He was with the Arsenal fringes of the first team.
Yeah, he sent me a text a few weeks back. Yeah.
And he's playing for Sutton United at 30, and I was looking at his game history, because it just seems, I get the little score updates on my phone, and he's in the lineup every time. So I look back. They've had 24 games this season in the conference, in the Vanarama National League, and they've had stretches of 4 games in 10 days, 3 games in 7 days, 8 and 24, and he plays 90 minutes every single game at age 30 without fail. And the guys like him, and I think Connor Cody's the best example in the Premier League of someone who plays every minute of every game, and in some years for Wolves it includes 10 to 12 Europe games. Why can't we get what's happening there in relation to our players, where we have to say, are we which game are we going to play Pepe in, which game is I think to be able to play, because it can't be both.
I don't think that's just Arsenal. That's everywhere. You look at Spurs this week, they'll rotate. You look at Man United this week, they'll rotate. I think that's it's not just Arsenal, but I think you have to also balance up the physical performance versus the technical performance. And don't forget, there's one person who knows better than most on that, and that's Mikel Arteta. He will know what he thinks is going to be physical performance versus technical performance. The other thing to balance up, I think, is who's the next best player after Craig Eastman. Might not be a great player, so they might consider Craig Eastman at 80% might be better than what the next best player might be. I think in Arsenal's case, in the top team's case around the Premier League, the next best player, fresh, may be considered by the manager a better option than who he considers the better player, not quite so fresh. You can't just look at the next game. I don't think. I think they have to use the squad in that situation. Now, having said that, Mikel might decide to put the same team out Thursday, Sunday, Thursday. If he thinks that's what's best for the team and to get the result, that's what he will do. And quite rightly, that's his job. So, yeah, Arsenal will have some players over the years that have played 50 games a season. I can't rattle them off now to you, but there's going to be players that have played 50 games a season.
Granite Xhaka, pretty much.
Yeah, and even going back 5-10 years, there'll be players that are just constantly playing games. Centre-backs can always do it. Centre-backs is a slightly different physical exertion. They're covering less ground in a game. There's slightly less attrition there. So Connor Cody being a centre-back, that can happen.
Yeah.
It's definitely multifactorial for sure. Do you want the same 11 every single week? They're all going to drop off slowly, I think is my main point there. You have to sometimes freshen things up for physical reasons, not just technical.
Is that the red zone area where, is that a thing? Is it something that, how much science versus just monitoring and discussion and stuff is there really in determining whether that famous red zone is approaching or not? Because in speaking to my medical community, which is just Arsenal fans on Twitter, there's a lot of concern about burning out a Bukayo Saka, and there was concern about burning out ESR, and whether his injury was burnout in red zone or whether it was something completely different. That's the unskilled impression from the lay person like myself. But is the red zone a thing, and how do you really tell when it's coming, especially with a young player who wants to be out there every week or twice a week?
There's plenty of data that's collected around training and games, and GPS tracking. Arsenal use StatSports, which is a tracking system for looking at data points in training, and track having matches will match up with that. So yeah, there's loads of data, lots of it, but you're never going to substitute that chat with a player. Physios and doctors and coaches and managers talking to players. How do you feel? I take your point. The young players are always going to want to be out there, but the young players will also be honest enough, and some would say naive enough, to be able to have that chat and discuss where they are. I think they're a team of individuals, if you know what I mean. They'll need treating differently. You'll know some players can go and play, and there's some you're going to think he needs a rest now and then. You're never going to get it right every time. It's an informed decision based around risk analysis. You can't get it right every time.
Yeah. Do the players, will they ever admit to being tired? Or I think you have another word that you use for the red zone or for fatigue. It starts with a K.
Go on.
Knackered, maybe.
Knackered. Yeah.
I have a good friend who loves the word knackered. She's always telling me how knackered she is.
Yeah, I think
that sounded really bad, actually. But.
The red zone thing is based around the sports science staff, S&C staff, looking at players' performances, looking at players, thousands of data points, and forming an opinion on it. And you use that to inform medical teams, to inform coaches. And that's all we are here to do, really, inform, try and educate and advise. We can't guarantee it's always right, but we are just educated gamblers. It's a risk analysis each week. And we hope to get it right the vast majority of the time. Gary tells a great story about Michael Thomas not being available for Anfield in 1989. And just literally a day before the game, they decided that it was worth the risk. They didn't think he was going to be right.
Just for 70, 75 minutes, though, right?
Yeah, but that's just he educated George Graham, and they said, "Look, we're going to play him." What a defining moment that would have been if Gary or the doctor or Michael Thomas had said, "I'm not right." it is just risk analysis, and we have to keep remembering the whole thing is about winning the game.
Yeah,
not always about reducing injuries. It's about winning the game.
So I'm going to ask this question from Bulgarian Gooner and hope, if you can answer it, great. But was the Barcelona quarterfinal in 2010 one of those few instances that Arsene or the players didn't listen to training staff in the cases of Gallas and Fabregas, who were both, I guess, rumored to not be ready, whether that's true or not, and both ended up getting injured in that game?
I'll be honest, I don't remember Gallas. I don't remember that being a conversation at all. That's annoying, isn't it? That shows I'm getting old, Mike. I don't
Either
remember
that or Bulgarian Gooner doesn't know what he's talking about, which is equally as likely.
Don't remember.
Probably a lot more likely.
I don't remember the William Gallas thing at all. I'm sorry to say.
Is that the game that Fabregas broke his leg?
No. Oh, yes, but don't believe that hype either. Fabregas had.
What do you mean by that?
No, Fabregas had suffered a tackle in the Birmingham game, I think it was, a few days before, and had been hit hard at the top of his fibula, a little bone that runs down the side of your leg, and the top of that fibula had been slightly chipped. It's called a flake fracture, and it's not dangerous. It's not in a nasty place, and it hadn't moved, and so he was reasonably okay and was desperate to play in that game, as you can imagine. We did a fitness test that morning. He passed it with a bit of discomfort, but was willing to play the game. Got through 91 minutes of that game and played well and was happy, but decided to smash that penalty down the middle.
I was going to say, wasn't that the kid that when he scored a penalty with a broken leg? I mean,
scored a penalty with a broken leg is extreme hype. Yeah,
that's right. But that's why I use the air quotes.
Yeah, a non-displaced chip fracture, flake fracture.
That doesn't sound as good though.
No, which had he side-footed that ball into the net, would have stayed a non-displaced flake fracture. Instead, in the 92nd minute, wherever it was late in the game. He smashed it down the middle. Now again, it earned us a point. He might have got us through that tie had we done well in the second leg. Was that an educated, worthwhile gamble? It's not for me to say, but that's sports medicine. It's gambles.
Has
that answered the question? Yeah, I don't know if I've swerved that question or not. I don't know. It's just
I think that's a better answer than Drago would have accepted to get. So, and again, I know. Coming up, I'm going to ask some questions about the current Arsenal team, and disclosure being that you're not treating these people, but you are a fan. You are, I'm assuming, watching and paying attention to how the team is doing. So, a couple of injury-related issues this year that I would like to discuss with you. One of them I have a very close kind of connection to, but the first one, the other one, Gabby Martinelli. A lot of hype for this young man, well-deserved. A lot of discussion about whether his kind of burst of appearances after getting back from injury a little earlier than expected, which he did really well in, followed by seemingly just presumably being fit, but being selected for the bench, but never getting into games. Is that your guess? Is that still injury related? Are they being extra careful with him? Is it something to do with how he's training or not training? Obviously you can't get in the head of Mikel Arteta injury wise, but he's not playing for the U23s. He is being selected for the teams, but not getting in as one of the 3 or 5 substitutions.
Mike, I don't know, Mike. I wouldn't even want to speculate. I wouldn't want to speculate. I still speak to the fellas there. I speak to the S&C coaches in the docks. I still speak to a lot of people there. I would never ask them stuff like that. Obviously, I don't know is the answer. Okay. I don't know. Yeah,
that's fair. Kevin Campbell says, "Hey, Magic Mike, I'll always be. I feel like I got to now dance on a table or something. But hope you're well. Hi, Colin. Hope you and your family are well from somebody who I think you probably got there right after Kevin was."
Yeah, we've met over the years. I think we crossed over by a few months before that, I think. But yeah, I've met him a few times, yeah.
Not a nicer man, whether Arsenal player or not, out there.
Lovely fella. Make sure you must have heard it. His Brian Clough story is one of the best So look out for that. I don't know. It must be somewhere on YouTube, but it's a great.
I'm sure it's probably on the Highbury Squad, but if not, we'll be seeing it. You got to tell that story. And if you haven't told on the Highbury Squad, don't tell Soph and come on our podcast and talk about it. But the second one, and this is something you don't necessarily have to have experience or knowledge of to maybe have a quick chat about it. This was a hotly debated issue between myself and some other know-it-alls in our know-it-all WhatsApp group, but both Christian from Chicago and myself wanted to know, do you recall Arsenal's first game with Wolves this season, the horror clash of heads between David Luiz and Raul Jimenez, where Raul Jimenez had a skull fracture and apparently he's expected to pass protocols and possibly make a return before the end of the season. But I had a very visceral reaction to what happened with David Luiz that day. And maybe I'm out of line, maybe I'm not. But, there have been stories of footballers carrying on after sustaining a concussion or sustaining a suspected concussion. And, we all look at Christoph Kramer in the World Cup as being probably the most extreme example of that. My wife worked with adults with acquired traumatic brain injury in her previous career, and just was really sensitized to those sort of things. But what we saw that day is David Luiz bleeding externally a lot, which doesn't necessarily mean anything, really lying still on the ground for a period of time, seeming a bit wobbly on his feet as he was helped up, and then 6 or 7 minutes later returning to the pitch for 20 or 30 minutes until being subbed off at halftime. And I'm sure your obligations are not only in the areas of muscle and bone and that sort of thing, but also in head injuries. And you've probably had to assess a high number of those in the highest of pressure situations on a pitch in front of a crowd, which this game wasn't. But how do you see the treatment of suspected head injuries evolving in the Premier League and in the sport? Do you think the addition of concussion substitutes would make a difference? And, is it possible that was the right thing to do, or should they have been extra cautious in looking out for the player, regardless of what they did in those 6 minutes, just because of the significance of the clash? It's like an 8-part question. Just choose whatever part you want to answer.
Yeah. Obviously, I know the doctor, Gary O'Driscoll, very well. I know the physio that day, Jordan Rees, very well. Two very good clinicians who know exactly what they're doing around head injury. Gary worked in rugby for years. He's a great knowledge on it. And Jordan would have received the same training as all that we all do around emergency pitch side action. All cuts, all bumps to the head aren't concussion. I think that's important to say. Just because someone gets a real nasty-looking cut on their head,
right,
it doesn't mean it's concussion. Was David Luiz concussed? I don't know. So it's not for me to comment on that. But for those two experienced people to allow him to carry on, they wouldn't have thought at that time he was concussed. That's all I can say. That's all I can say. He may well have been taken off half-time because they couldn't control the blood, and maybe the cut was too bad. I don't know. But that would be more likely explanation for me. I know that sounds really defensive, but they are two very good people who know what they're doing. Concussion subs is a good thing, I think. Anything that eases the pressure on physios and doctors doing pitch-side assessments, on-pitch assessments with that amount of pressure. Anything that eases that pressure has got to be good.
I always wonder, if there's a concussion substitute and you decide to take David Luiz out in that moment, but don't if there's not a concussion substitute. Are you?
Then you're suspecting concussion, then he should come off. So some people would say that why are you having concussion subs? If you're suspecting it, get them off. So that's where rugby has done it over the years. I don't think very well. Rugby thinks they've done it very well. I'm not sure that it could improve. I don't know. But it's a good thing that it's moving the right way to give the on-pitch pressure situation more time, because it isn't easy. I've assessed loads in my time. I hope I got them right. There's every chance I may have got one or two wrong. I don't know. Concussion can, show itself 24, 48 hours later. it's an impossible situation that none of us would like to be in. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I compare it to certain sports here in the U.S. I mean, you see a lot of concussion in ice hockey, for example, and obviously in American football, and they tend to have very, very regimented. I mean, they didn't always. It was far, far too late addressed, I think, in any sport. But they tend to have very specific protocols. They take the players off of the pitch or the field. They put them in dark evaluation areas. They take their time. Now, these are games where the substitution rules are different. You can come out of the game and go back into the game, so I understand that. But to me, my initial visceral reaction in that moment is, how was that enough time to determine whether there's potential problems with second impact syndrome or whatever it's called? And I'm not wanting to dig into the individuals involved in that situation, more just to get a sense of, are there further changes that would benefit the things that matter most, which is the long-term health of the players, to make it less about risk versus competition and more just about having your cake and eating it too, to not put somebody in jeopardy? Are there rule changes that you think could make that easier on the people who have to make those decisions?
Difficult without interfering with the spectacle of the game, and I know that isn't the main consideration here. It's got to be the health of the players, but I think the current set of rules, with the current set of training in the background for the current set of people in the Premier League that are seeing these people on the pitch, education of the players is important. I think just as much of that, education of the media, especially the ones covering the games, is important, because you hear commentators start talking about concussion. Everyone's influenced by that commentator. I think sometimes they should perhaps hold back a little bit or get better educated on what's going on. Otherwise, every time someone gets a bump on the head or a cut on the head, the word concussion is going to get mentioned, and it's awful. Yeah, and it really isn't the case.
No, one is a muscle injury inside the head. I mean, the brain being that muscle. The other is a superficial wound that, can they both be present at the same time? Yeah, but one doesn't mean the other. I agree.
There's no physio or doctor out there that's thinking, "Oh, he should stay on. We need to win this game." That's never going to be the case. Players often think that, but who's the person you trust least in the situation of a concussion? The person who's concussed. So that's all I would say. But on
the other end of the spectrum, a great question from Yo-Yo. Did players ever feign injuries on the pitch to waste time? I don't think that's the question that needs to be answered. I think we know the answer to that.
Yeah.
And the good question is, did you look favorably on these players from a competitive standpoint, or were you angered by them wasting your time?
I think same answer, Mike. Win the game. That's the most important thing. So when it was your players doing it and you thought it was a brilliant tactical diversion to slow the game down at the end of it, great news. I don't mind running onto a pitch to deal with that.
So what
when the other team did it, of course you're jumping and you're not best pleased.
But as one of the only people that would know, then, like what are the conversations? Is there a code that's given? Because the cameras are all over the place. Does the guy say fish and chips, and then
no.
And then that you have to just look busy rather than actually be taking care of something?
No, I think you get onto a player. The most important thing to establish in those first 10 seconds, is it serious? Secondly, can they carry on? That's all you need to really know. You're not going to do much physiotherapy on that pitch. It's, can they carry on? Is it serious? And as soon as you get there and a player says, "We're all good, give me a drink," or "We're all good,"
cramp.
We're all good. And also, you don't often discuss it in that situation, Mike. You might discuss it afterwards. Everyone knows what's going on.
I wouldn't advise there be because somehow you'll get a lip reader who's you got
the referee knows what's going on. He's trying to tell you to get off the pitch as quickly as you can, and you get relationships with referees over the years. I think full well that the referee knows, and he's going to put another 30 seconds on now, so it's largely pointless anyway.
Right.
It's just part of the circus, I suppose.
So I've read that you've expressed some concern, and I would imagine there's great concern, especially as more money gets thrown into the game, but about outside influences medically in football. Outside influences beyond the club's medical staff and you and your team. Whether it's, I guess, agents or business managers or sponsors. and whether it's about my guy needs to be playing because we need him out there, or we want you to be extra cautious with him because we want his next contract to be good. But I mean, what do you attribute that to? And cynical people could obsess over the contradictory agendas for players that are making millions every year, millions every month. But your desire is to get players fit and available for the club as soon as possible. How do these outside influences, even outside medical people that are brought in, influence the game?
Agents have never really influenced it. Agents have never really said my boy needs to be playing, nothing like that. I think they take a step back. We try and keep them educated in certain cases, but they wouldn't influence it, not in my time anyway. They've always been very good in my experience. Outside therapists occasionally can become a problem because they can never be wrong, really. They're not accountable for the issue. The easiest decision for an outside therapist is don't play this weekend. It's very easy to say that. You're not involved with the club. You don't have to consider any risk. You're not accountable. So that becomes a little bit more difficult. It's becoming tougher. When you speak to physios around the clubs, they've all got a little issue with an external therapist here or there that muddies the waters in their management of injuries. But
Does that go the same for doctors, like second opinions and that sort of thing?
No, less so with the doctors. It seems to be physios, occasionally S&C coaches, that outside independents who influence players a little bit. Listen, sometimes it can be healthy, sometimes it can be good, but on the whole, no. I think it muddies the waters. Doctors, not really, but doctors at clubs are humble enough and sensible enough and politically astute enough to know that if a second opinion is looking likely, they'll be with the player to get that second opinion. They're not going to force an issue where a player goes behind anyone's back. I think it's important that everyone is on the same page when it comes to injury management. So if we ever get the sense that a player is looking for a second opinion around something, we'll make sure we're involved in searching for that. A German player gets injured and wants a German surgeon to do the operation, you have to respect that opinion. And you can say, look, we'd like an English opinion as well as your German opinion, and that often happens. But if that German player wants the German surgeon to do it, and we've checked them and they seem to be very good, experienced people, then you have to make the right decision for the player at the end of the day.
And I'm sure that's a lot of the reason why, from the time you see an injury to the time you really know as a fan what the prognosis is going to be, there's a lengthy delay because a lot of those things are.
Yeah, exactly. Well, people guess anyway, Mike, don't they?
That's true. So I got some rapid fire questions after we talk about kind of the end of the road with Arsenal, real briefly, and then if you have in the chat any kind of other questions that you'd like for Colin to answer, please do get those in now. But May 2018 arrives, and the changes around the club are in full flow. Arsene, we all knew, was going to be departing at the end of that season, but the rest of the shuffle and reorganization wasn't really known until the final whistle in the season. And after more than half your life at that time, the ride is over. And I don't mean to bring back bad memories, but from your perspective, working your entire career with Arsene Wenger and seeing that change coming, were you looking forward to continuing on under a new manager, under a new team? And the departure wasn't something that you initiated, unfortunately. So what was that time like?
Yeah, we knew that he was heading off, the same as everyone else knew, in that final few weeks. And Arsene often talks about it, like it was seeing his own funeral. The outpouring of emotion and the respect he was given, and some of the things that were written about him, and some of the messages he was receiving, and were so good. It was so great. He said he was like watching his own funeral at times. It was lovely, the things he was being honoured with and credited with. And that last day of the season with him on the pitch, I think was a lovely thing to do. No, I think we all felt we were carrying on. But the director of performance at the time was a fellow called Darren Burgess, who came in the year before, and he wanted to freshen up the medical team. And
was he brought in by Raul and those guys, or was he one of those hires, or Ivan?
Difficult to talk about that. Probably in the background, Ivan, I would say. There's a long story there. But, yeah, Ivan brought him in. He came in, worked for a year with us, decided he wanted to freshen up the medical team, and I was moved on. And my 3 assistants, who were really good, experienced physios, Andy Rolls, Ben Ashworth, and Jimmy Haycock, who were 3 really good, experienced physios. We had 60, 70 years between us. They were inadvertently moved on as well in the same shake-up. And, yeah, he brought his people in. I think he was moved on about a year later, or they parted company a year later, and along with the people that he brought in. So that was fairly short-lived for various reasons. But, yeah, it was a shame. It was something that was difficult at the time because it was all I'd known. I was still enjoying it. I was looking forward to working under a new manager. We didn't know who that was going to be at the time. There was lots of speculation about who would it be. Yeah, deal with it, get on with it. Decided not to burn any bridges. Let's keep this nice and civil. I've had a good run on this merry-go-round. Let's depart civil very nicely. Yeah,
I always say everything happens for a reason. It just takes an awful long time sometimes for that reason to become apparent. And and here you are running a clinic, doing things the way that you want to do, and hopefully happier than ever. Some rapid fire questions. And I appreciate you hitting on some of the delicate points and being fair, answering what you can, and obviously not burning bridges through this podcast.
No, listen. A lot of the people I brought in, Mike's still there. I mean, the doctor's still there, and there's some brilliant people still there. So it's great to see him still doing well and enjoying it. Understood.
All right, a couple rapid fire questions for me, and then we'll get to some of the user questions. Tell us the truth. Was it your idea to have Theo Walcott flash the 2-0 to the Spurs supporters from the gurney? I'd like to credit you with that.
No, I'm afraid it wasn't. I don't think Theo quite realised at the time how serious that injury was, but we did suffer a fair few coin injuries in that little. In that little 20 metres, yeah. Had we had a jar, we would have made a few pounds, yeah.
All right, here's some tougher ones. What was up with Kim Kallstrom?
That's not going to be quick fire. This is in the public. This is in the public domain, so I'm not telling you anything else that's not out there already. We did his medical. One of the scans came back with 3 fractures in his back after doing an overhead kick in the Dubai desert on tour with Spartak Moscow. We said to him, "You've got fractures in your back. You're going to be 6 weeks out." And he said, "I've been feeling back pain." So we said, "Look, there's 14 weeks left of the season. That's how long was left. There was 14 weeks left." We went and discussed it with Arsene and Dick Law. It was deadline day.
And you said he'd be out for how long? 12?
6 weeks.
6.
So he'd be back to play the last 8-ish weeks of the season. And Arsene said, "Look, it's deadline day. I like him as a player. We're taking him." Now, the media decided that, I think in the next few days, they thought he'd gone out to train and got injured in training and he'd fooled us all in the medical, which is just rubbish, We knew he had a back fracture. It wasn't serious. It was transverse processes. It wasn't serious, but we knew he was 6 weeks out. Kim was very grateful. He thought the dream was over. He thought he wasn't going to join us. But then Arsene decided, yes, we'll take him anyway. And I believe he started one game against West Ham, didn't he? And he scored the penalty in the semi.
So the penalty in the semi, I will never forget that. Well, I mean, when he stepped up to take that kick against Wigan, I'm in our pub down in DC. I'm holding my son, who's 11 at the time. I guess I wasn't holding him, but watching that penalty, I'm like, this will make it all worthwhile if he makes this penalty.
Yeah. And also, what a lovely fella as well. Really professional, really nice professional fella.
Fantastic. Well, calculated risks. I mean, signing Kieran Tierney was a calculated risk. One that I think we would all agree was a good one. All right, Mesut Ozil. Given what was Mesut Ozil had a lot of injuries. The injuries didn't tend to last that long, and some might wonder. And let's make this a more generic question, not mentioning any specific players' names. Do players sometimes get cover of injury in order to, when other reasons are to blame for them not being in the lineup, whether it's being rotated out for performance issues but not wanting to embarrass the player, whether it's rest or maintenance days. I mean, does that happen in football?
So having just mentioned Mesut Ozil at the start of that, you then say you want to do a generic question.
We did discuss this beforehand, so I'm not trying to.
No,
I decided to meld two questions together, I guess, because I was also, I'm also of the mind, and I could be completely wrong with this, so that we don't make this completely about Mesut Ozil. I'm of the mind, as I mentioned to you, that Aubameyang's recent injury before the family issues. To me, it sounded like a convenient way of masking a benching. Whether I would have no way of knowing whether that's true or not, but just that suspicion. So you kind of assume over the years that there are some cases where a player has a very minor injury that it might not actually be an injury. So
yeah, I think Aubameyang was injured, but I don't know that. I think it was a minor injury. The manager has to pick the best 11 who he thinks are going to win that game. I think is the easiest way of saying it. And if he gets an impression that certain players aren't up for that game or don't seem to be ready to play in that game or have got one eye on the game which is coming up after that particular game, the manager may decide to pick the best 11 to win the next game. Is injury ever used as a cover? Occasionally.
I use injury as a cover all the time. Like when I don't feel like
that's a sick day.
Yeah. My injury is I can't get out of the chair, but that's my own.
I think that's every manager at every club in every decade since football began. The manager's got to pick the team who he thinks will win that next game.
And perhaps some managers have a different approach in man management to that than others might, which could potentially cause some alienation between the club and the players in some cases at a generic club that we might be discussing. So, all right, moving on to some user questions from Tom Sevens in my home state of Virginia. What do the players typically drink or eat at halftime? My addition to that is, what temperature do their halftime steaks and lobster get cooked at? But what are foods that you see these creams and bars and stuff that they're putting in? But that, and are there any negative effects for athletes associated with drinking sugar-free beverages because of the artificial sweeteners? And I'll take a sip of my sugar-free beverage with artificial sweeteners, which could explain this.
Yeah, the good way to swerve that is, obviously, we had nutritionists in place who would be answering all those questions. And, we employed nutritionists from about 2010, I think. And their expertise, their skill, their knowledge and everything is in refining what the players eat and drink at half time. So that's changed over the years. We've been through periods of just water. We've been through periods of a certain percentage sugar drink, for example, Lucozades and Gatorades, those sort of drinks. I think players have to do what's individually right for them under the advice of the nutritionist. So some players will need a little bit more than others, but this is all done around analysis and chats and practice it in training. What do you feel good works for you in training? So what do they eat at halftime is fairly minimal, if not nothing. There's not a lot of eating. No, you're right, Mike. There's not a lot of eating going on. Occasionally there'll be the energy bar idea if certain players need it around feeling that they need one, and the nutritionist has got them on a program that they might need one occasionally. It's not what do teams eat, it's what do individuals eat, really. I think it's based around what they've done and what they've seen.
What they can tolerate.
Well, yeah, with their close relationships with the nutritionist, they'd have honed, hopefully, over the time before and the training days before, what works for them. So it varies, and it's varied at different clubs, and it's varied at Arsenal over the years, is the answer. I know that's vague, but that's the truth.
Okay. What do you think about the sugar-free sports drinks? I know you mentioned about kind of going through phases, but I actually really want to know, because I drink a lot of them, unfortunately. I know they're not good, but artificial sweeteners.
Not my expertise, Mike. I think I think it's the in moderation. I don't think it's the end of the world. I think if you're sat there drinking 10 of them during this podcast, I think that's different. But,
well, you would have known that by me having gotten up a few times.
Yeah. I think it's not my expertise. Sugar-free drinks. We have people in place to look after that. But okay. I think in moderation, it's not the end of the world.
From Fredo in New Orleans, most of football's governing bodies are looking at expanding their competitions as a way to make up for lost revenue from this last year. How much stress does that put on physios and medical teams to keep players fresh and healthy, given the additional wear and tear on bodies? I mean, do we have enough games already, or do we need to be adding additional competitions that are going to run these players down even more?
Yeah, there's probably enough. And I think you start adding more in, you start looking at squad sizes and everything else. But I think as medical teams, we do know that the football has to come first to a level. There's a commercial involvement, isn't there, in everything that happens now. I think the welfare of the players has started to become a bit more important in the last 5-10 years, for sure. I don't think I think their voice is getting heard. In America, more than me, NFL and stuff like that, you can't train without one of the PFA reps being by the pitch, can you? I think, let's limit the games if we can. Let's try and make sure that they're getting some sort of rest, physical and mental, each summer. And I know that's not always possible when you've got international players playing tournaments. And it's not easy when the tournament finishes something stupid like July 10, July 15, and everyone else is already back pre-season training. It's very difficult. But that's when it's down to clubs and managers and S&C teams, medical teams, to ensure that their player gets appropriate rest, because you can get him back if you like, but without some sort of mental and physical rest, they're probably going to hit a wall somewhere in the autumn. So, again, it comes down to risk analysis, Mike. That's all we did a lot of the time, was to show that, present that, and educate people if we could.
It's got to be an interesting combination of science and art.
Exactly.
Sure. From Sophie Nicolau of the Highbury Squad, question related to your clinic. This actually sounds like more of it's a question and a statement, I guess. Love the concept of the new venture. Ordinary weekend warriors get the pro athlete treatment. Would they consider an annual scholarship? It's not cheap, but to gift a regular football fan this type of life-changing experience would be great, and a solid legacy for them too. Sophie's spending your money for you already, but does something like that exist? Is there? Do you work with the community in that regard, or?
We're not really set up for that yet. Obviously, I know we're 18 months old, but COVID just slapped right in the middle of it, and so it's a very odd startup business at the moment, because we haven't really got everything set up for that. But no, it's something, as we expand, it's certainly something we'll consider. But you're right, the community thing's important to get into the sports teams around here. And there's so much sport in this area, you wouldn't believe it. We're sort of East London, Essex boards, and it's, a wealth of sport that you wouldn't believe, the number of weekend warriors. But it's, something we need to think about. Is this my chance to plug the clinic Instagram feed, Mike, at the Lewin Clinic? Is that allowed?
At any point in here, I was certainly going to ask you that at the end, but if you started every answer throughout this entire podcast with that, I would have been fine. So I should have probably told you that at the beginning.
No, you're okay.
And I think that is the beginning of the end here. If you have time for one or two more questions, there's just so much out here. From Yo-Yo, who's been asking some real blinders today. Were you able to enjoy watching Arsenal, or were you like a worried parent on the sidelines?
Yeah, that's a good question. You don't ever actually watch the game. I used to go home and watch it in the evening on TV. Yeah, my wife wasn't too pleased with that, as you can imagine. She thought I just...
Isn't it enough Arsenal already? Like, what do you...
Yeah, she's
bringing your work home with you.
Yeah, obviously you're down at pitch level. Obviously, you're a few seconds behind the ball at times, seeing how people have reacted to certain challenges or kicks or sprints or whatever. You're not actually watching the game as such, or you might be down with an injury, assessing that while the game's going on. You might miss certain bits and pieces. And yeah, it is tense. It is intense. It is a pressure 90 minutes. If you include the pre and post match and the half time, it's a pressure 2.5 hours. And you didn't always appreciate the good and the bad sometimes of what you've seen. So, we were very lucky. I've been on the bench at 8 FA Cup finals and won 7. So I consider that extremely lucky to have been part of that. But I've had to watch every FA Cup final again because you don't see it, you don't take it in, you don't appreciate what you've been part of because you've got a job to do that day. I know that sounds cliche, but the answer to the question is a bit of a worried parent, and you enjoy the aftermath of the result. Do you actually enjoy the game? Not sure.
Yeah, I mean, we could ask that question of an usher, and they probably get a chance to enjoy it a little bit more.
Yeah.
Except when people stand up and they have to jump into action. But
exactly.
So Daniel, Robert, is there a sleep schedule? Do players have to sleep later when there's evening kickoffs the day after, and vice versa, or do they kind of know what they need to do?
Again, it's an individual thing. Some players need different approaches. Some players would nap on the afternoon of an evening game. Some didn't like it because it made them feel groggy. Again, we had sleep expertise available to us. We had education and advice for the players on that sort of thing. A difficult thing that a lot of players complained about was after evening games not being able to sleep. The adrenaline and various other bits and pieces in their bodies. And so late games, it was often a problem for some players sleeping that night. So we'd often start training a bit later next day sometimes to allow them to have a bit of a sleep. But, players have got kids as well, Mike, so you might find they were jumped on at 7 a.m. anyway. So, you had to consider everything. But was their sleep schedule to a level? We had meal times, obviously. That was important, so they couldn't be sleeping during the meal times. It was advice, education, and an individual approach, really. But, they're not kids. They get to know by the time they get to Arsenal what works for them. Yeah,
absolutely. And the last question, is Alba's celebration dangerous? I have always worried about that, like that he's going to turn an ankle or something. But what's the medical view of a guy doing front flips after every goal that he scores?
I suppose the answer to that is, could we bring the risk down a bit? Yes, we could if he didn't do it.
You put like a trampoline, like a mat. Like, could you have someone stationed on the end line to just push a mat out there real quick so that you can just stick the landing?
Listen, it's nice. It's all part of the emotion, isn't it? I think it's important in football. But there are some horror stories out there of what's happened to players that have done perhaps a bit more exaggerated than that. But no,
there's field goal kickers in the NFL who've pulled quads, broken their ankle, celebrating, and
listen, I could write you a chapter. I could write you a chapter in a book on goal celebration injuries easily.
I would love that.
But it's I'd rather minimise the risk, Mike. You know what physios and doctors are like. Can we bring the risk down?
Absolutely. Well, Colin, thank you. I know you haven't minimized your risk by spending an hour and a half with me. Hopefully, you don't regret it. Now's a good time as any to tell us again where we can find you. And I mean, on social media. I don't mean like your home address. But how can we learn more about your private practice and anything else that you'd like to kind of get out there to the Gooner family? I'm
on Twitter at Lewin Physio. The clinic is on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. That is at the Lewin Clinic. And come and see what we're writing about and what we're posting. And we do get the occasional Arsenal-related people come into here. And we had Dennis Bergkamp and Canu's boys come in recently. So that's one way of making you feel old, Mike, when you're treating their kids.
It's another reason why I need to basically become a stowaway in the clinic.
Yeah, but when you're treating their kids, it makes you feel old, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Well, if you enjoy this kind of content, please like and subscribe to the pod. Click the notification bell. You'll get an alarm every time we go on air. Make sure it is 7:30 now. Make sure to go straight over and check out the Highbury Squad. They're doing an Olympiacos preview show with a Athens-based journalist, Antonis Saoulis, and then another episode of Kevin Says with Kevin Campbell at 9 p.m. For now, that's it for us. We'll be back Friday night with the Highbury Squad crew, Soph and Amanda, for my big fat Greek podcast birthday show. which may involve some Uzo shots and a attempt to completely avoid the fact that we have a North London derby this weekend. So that's it. Thank you so much, Colin, for joining. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks for having me.
Someday we'll get to do it again. And in the meantime, come on, you Gooners.